So our big test is coming up for our Native American section that we've been working on, Indigenous people. Just want to give you some tips so that you can do the best on it that you're able. So I kind of have a couple things I'm going to show you. I would recommend watching this video more than once watch it until you feel like you know everything in it, so that when we take the test, you will feel prepared. So I kind of have this broken up here. The Pacific Northwest. So that was the Northwest Coastal Tribe. That's what we were calling it. That's a little different. But yes, it's in that area and went up a little further. Remember the Northwest Coastal Tribes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about them. We're going to go down here. Their homes were called longhouses. Those were cedar plank houses, and totem poles were very important to them. So remember, they were using cedar trees and totem poles to build their longhouses and their smokehouses. Their smokehouses is where they did different ceremonies and things. So keep that in mind. That's Pacific Northwest. You can remember that they would salmon and things like salmon and whale and trout were really important to them because they lived right on the ocean there and had very easy access to ocean creatures and water creatures. So keep that in mind, that was what they used a lot of, was whale and salmon and things like that. The trees they used most were cedar trees. So remember the name of that. Cedar trees were for the Northwest Coastal Tribe, and they used a lot of bark, which one other tribe did as well. But lots of bark. Their climate was very wet and rainy and mild. Okay, so that's the overview of the Pacific Northwest coastal tribes. So longhouses, salmon, cedar trees, bark, and mainly rainy and mild, right? Not super hot, not super cold. All right, let's look at our desert Southwest. So remember, the Southwest was down here. They were the tribe that had very little natural resources because of where they lived. So they built their homes called pueblos out of adobe brick. So remember, the bricks were made out of the clay that they show right here. So they would take that clay, shape it into a brick, and create their homes. Remember, their homes could be 4 or 5 stories high, housing more than one family, almost like an apartment building today. The main animal they had access to was rabbit. There aren't a lot of animals that live in the desert, so that was their main animal. They did collect water, so they were able to grow corn, beans, and squash, but water was definitely hard to come by. There was not a lot of it, and that was one of their main struggles, is they didn't have very much water. Their climate was hot and dry with, like I said, very little water. And then again, as we talked about, they had very cold nights and hot days. So that made it tricky to live there as well, because they could get very cold in the night and they didn't have a lot of ways to stay warm. Of course, fires, but they didn't have wood to burn. So it just was a very minimal natural resources, made it tricky. And so that was our desert tribes. We also have our Eastern Woodlands tribes. Their homes were called wigwams. They also had longhouses, but wigwams is the term that we want to remember for the Eastern Woodlands. They were the only ones that used homes called wigwams, so that's the term we want to remember. So Eastern Woodlands, remember, it was the part that was east of the Mississippi over until the Atlantic Ocean. So that's the part of the world we're talking about for the Eastern Woodlands. They had lots of trees, different types of trees. They used birch for a lot of things. That was one of their main resources because they lived right in the woods. So they had access to as many trees as they needed. As always with Native Americans, they were not wasteful, though. They wouldn't cut down more trees than they actually needed. They had lots of fresh water, which of course makes life easier in general if you have easy access to water. And they had lots of animals. Like this says, it was good for food, clothing, blankets, tools, weapons, art, and they had berries. So lots of resources for the Eastern Woodlands tribes. They did have the 4 seasons just like we do. So they had cold winters with snow and they had hot summers. So their climate is our climate because they are occupying the same part of the world that we are. So they had the 4 seasons for their climate. I'm going to post this in our Google Classroom as well, but please get familiar with who is who for your test. One more sheet I'm going to read over with you. This will also be posted in there. This is a completed study guide. Since it's difficult for us to do this together, I thought I'd give it to you so you can study it. But look through it. The Northwest, what their food was like, what their housing was like, clothing, their traditions. The important things here, totem pole was a big one you'll want to remember for Northwest. Mild and rainy, mostly what we talked about on the other one, but a little bit more detail. Southwest, here's what they had. Their food for Southwest was corn, beans, squash, rabbit, some wild turkeys, and some wild deer when they could find them. You know, their pueblos, as we talked about, traditions. So read through these and actually spend some time with that. Another thing here, the Northwest Native Americans use cedar plank to build their shelters. We're just kind of coming up with words that go with these. Their environment, they use their environment to survive. Adapt, because these are words that will be on your test, so make sure you kind of understand what they mean. But adapt, Native Americans had to adapt the natural resources around them to survive, like trees for houses and weapons. Resources are things in nature that people find useful. Climate, the climate of the Southwest was dry and hot. Vegetation, plants of an area. Landforms, the landforms you would find in the Northwest were mountains and flat rocky beaches. So we're using these were some student examples I had before of either defining it or using it in the sentence. So get familiar with these terms because they will look familiar on your test. Okay, so just as like a final reminder, I want to remind you of how the indigenous people were the first people in Americas, right? They traveled here with the Bering Land Bridge. The first people were originally thought to be from Siberia, remember, over in Asia, and they walked and followed large animals over here. I want to remind you to look at your map so you remember where these tribes lived because you will be asked that. Let's see, I just want to make sure I've said everything that you might need to know. Let's see. Okay, so just a couple more things to remind you of. Remember how we talked about push and pull factors, right? Push factors are something in your area that make you want to leave it, and pull factors are things that from another area that make you want to go there. So like the first people felt that pull factor of the food that they needed, right? So they needed food, so they felt that pulling them away from their area because they needed food to survive. So they were pulled away. Let's see. One thing that I'm not sure we specifically said is what the definition of geography is. So just so you have that, geography is the study of the earth and the way people interact with the earth. So what we've been talking about, but I don't know if we said that word. So geography is the study of the earth and the way people interact with the earth. We talked about adapting, right? Changing your lifestyle to fit your environment. We talked about culture and how it's your beliefs. Good. These are all things you'll need to know. Make sure you're pulling them out of your brain, and if you don't, that's why you're watching this, to help you remember. Let's see. I do want to show you just a little bit of the map that's going to be on the test because it's slightly different than the map we looked at before. So we talked about the map. They kind of broke it up a little further on this one. So we've got 4 right here is our Northwest coastal right there. And then 6, we have our Southwest right here. And then 7, we have our Eastern woodlands. So keep those in mind as you're working, because this is the actual test right here asking you to label those. So make sure you can remember which is which. They do group 7 and 8 together, though, to be the eastern woodland. So it is more similar to the map that we looked at together. So please watch this video over and over and over until you feel like you know it by heart, because it will very much help you with your test.